I was very careful.
I'm very excited.
Can everyone take their seats, please? Good morning. Today I'm introducing the topic of politics and ecology. These are two vital and pressing crises that do not so much invite us today as theologians to consider them as impose themselves on us for questions for discussion. Earlier in this conference, we confronted the question of phenomenology, of a vision of ontology in which we sunk deep into the veil of the flesh and drew it over our eyes. This, as profound as this vision and confrontation is, it carries, as other speakers have noted, a great risk that we blind ourselves to the wider dimension, not only of God, but also of nature and our fellow man. This sense of beginning the question of ontology, not simply enclosed in the body, or even in the abstraction or an abstractly construed metaphysics, but caught up in the middle of relation. Not only our relation to each other, not only to the natural world, but to the cosmos and to God. And we are caught up, in fact, in God's own self-relation, his self-knowing, his self-disclosure, and his self-emptying. And this is the crucial Trinitarian origin, which I think we will find with these two speakers, as they consider a mode of doing politics, a mode of doing ecology, and a mode of thinking theologically that begins caught up in relation. Okay, so our first speaker will be Ragnar Bergem, who is a postdoctoral fellow of the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society, working on topics of representation, the discovery of the common, and questions of place. Ragnar Bergem is originally a graduate of Cambridge, so we're very happy to welcome him back to speak to us today. Ragnar?
Can you hear me? No? Not at all? Now? No. Okay. It's on. Should I use this mic then? Or? Is it green? It is green. Oh, okay. Now we're talking. I'm talking. Okay. Thank you, Sebastian. Political ontology promised a multitude of pathways to rediscovering the political at a time when the sun was setting for postmodernism. The theoretical project, which has been carried forward by a range of French continental thinkers, responds to the failure of modern politics to represent and ground itself in society. Political ontology interprets this failure as evidence for the contingency and ultimate groundlessness of every political project, and concomitantly the incomplete character or the failed character of society. Nonetheless, having accepted this postmodern gesture, political ontology seeks to reconstitute the political action by other means. In this paper, I will argue that political ontology, although it admirably seeks to reconsider political action in a post-foundational political world, it suffers from a lack of attention to the actuality of the common, to thinking about what we actually share. And I think in a moment where the House of Commons is empty, and a time in which we are very aware of the precarity of our natural and global condition, I think thinking about the common is at least worthwhile doing. Further, I will suggest that such attention to the common is demanded by informed Trinitarian thought. However, I will not argue that only a Trinitarian ontology is adequate to the task of explicating the sense and possibility of political action, for I find myself slightly hesitant towards such unconditional claims. And further, I don't think Trinitarian ontology provides exactly what political ontology is after. Still, I will be arguing that Trinitarian theology and ontology, as a kind of practice of thought, spurs reflection on the common, which is urgently needed in today's political context. So, the very moment society, in the modern sense of the word, presented itself to political thought, it produced a new instability. The notion of society would form the backbone of political regimes legitimized by the notion of the social contract, yet it also loomed over established power when the latter was deemed illegitimate. Political life was supposed to represent and ground itself in society. With the arrival of the liberal states, and subsequently of mass society, the dialectic of civil society and states became a formidable issue. In the mid-18th century, expounding motives already present in Rousseau, Marx pointed out that the division between society and state produced a divided subject, masking deep inequality and preventing real representation. With Carl Schmitt, a strangely similar objection was launched from the right. He claimed that the liberal compromise was unable to mediate between society and the state, with the result paradoxically being the blurring of their lines and the implosion of democracy. How can political action and institutions be grounded in society when the latter is a pandemonium of differences, conflicts, and forces? This very difficulty of representing society is part of the prehistory of contemporary political ontology. And political ontology in this context refers to the project of a generation of continental thinkers whom, starting around the 1980s, have continued to develop the project to this day. Here I would include Claude Lefort, Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, Etienne Balibar, Jean-Luc Nancy, as well as Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. Granting the postmodern critique of representation, they nonetheless seek to think the political in order to escape the postmodern denigration of truth and action. Now, this is obviously a very big group of people, but I'd like to sort of create a small ideal typology because I think this group converge around three interrelated traits. The first trait, one which is both of an ontological and definitional sort, is the very distinction between politics and the political. In the German context, this differentiation can be found in thinkers such as Schmitt and Hannah Arendt, while in the French, the distinction has been developed by a range of thinkers whom I mentioned above. The concept of the political and its distinction from politics works as an indicator of the absence of an absolute ground of society. Society is, in Claude Lefort's words, unable to see itself. It cannot be represented properly in political institutions. Building on the Heideggerian difference between being and beings, political ontology searches for political difference after the failure of representation. Politics in this context refers to actuality, the political stuff, the struggle, victory, and processes of everyday life. It is equivalent to the level of beings, the ontic. The political is the term for that absent yet necessary ground for political action. It is equivalent to what Heidegger calls being and what political ontologists variously interpret as lack, the void, multitude, antagonism, and so on. The second trait is an ontology of radical contingency. The difficulty with representing society is ontologized as the contingent nature of the given, because no actual last ground may be found among the order of causes. From this position, political ontology deduces the inevitable failure of every positive political project. One could interpret this as a fairly common Machiavellian view of politics. And indeed, there are Machiavellian moments, for example, in Le Fort or Laclau. However, political ontology tends to radicalize the role of contingency to the point of it becoming absolute. And one may observe, broadly speaking, two approaches to how one should move from the affirmation of the radical contingency of politics to the recuperation of the political. On the one hand, Jean-Luc Nancy and others admit the dissolution of the subject and of the political act in the traditional sense. For Nancy, the space of contingency, the world in which we are radically exposed to one another, simply is a form of sharing. The structural lack of every identity is what we all share. They quote, no longer having in any form a substantial identity. On the other hand, so-called post-Althusserians, such as Badiou, Rancière, and Laclau, seek to reconceptualize the subject and thus bring about the possibility of political action by means of a logic that escapes the dialectic of state and society. Badiou famously conceptualizes the new political center by means of a non-ontological event which spawns the subject, thereby instituting a definite gap between the positive order of being and the order of the event. The third trait is of a logical sort. It is the identification, or at least the near identification, of the universal and the singular. Because politics cannot arise out of some positive ground, something that is properly shared, the political difference must outstrip the complex negotiation between what is held by individual agents, what is shared by particular groups, and what is universally available. Instead, political ontology posits the immediacy of the universal and the singular. Either one simply represents the radical contingency of the given as the universal condition in which we all share, because we all live in a radically contingent and therefore irreducibly singular world, or, as for the post-Althusserians, one reconstitutes the subject around a struggle whose universal character, its transcendence vis-à-vis any specific identity, is guaranteed by its inner void. One might call this latter the Pauline model, as the Apostle famously has figured as an important inspiration for this move. Now, in his book On the Universal, published in 2014, François Julien, a French sinologist working on Chinese philosophy, but who also specializes in the Greek classical tradition, deals with the problem of the common. His analysis of the essential categories of Western thought allows us to position political ontology not only philosophically, but also as a historical interpretation of the Christian tradition of Trinitarian thought. Julien takes the category of the universal, whose opposite is the irreducibly singular, to be the invention of Greek reason, controversially so. The universal is absolute, he says, in the sense of being exceptionalist due to its foundation in reason, which may formulate principles that transcend the particularities of experience. We can sort of see the haunting of Kant really here in his reading. The common, in distinction to the universal, is a political concept, which, quote, signals towards that never completely determinable ground, the groundless ground, from which, even without being to measure it, we collectively draw and whose resources we ceaselessly exploit. Participation in the common is the condition for belonging in a polis, a political community. However, because the common in and of itself says nothing of its extension or limit, Julien warns that it almost necessarily inverts to what is, in fact, its opposite, the particular, that which is held by only some. This inversion is due to the radical contingency of the world. Every particular thing shared is contingently shared, and political communities inevitably turn particularist and exclusivist when they defend the common against the radical contingency of social reality. And that is why so many of these French thinkers often identify, like almost by instinct, community with what they call, in the French context, communitarianism. So how does one prevent the common from enclosing itself? Historically, Julian claims, the common expanded by merging with the universal. Stoic cosmopolitanism represents the first encounter between the universal and the common, facilitated by Roman law. It allowed a conception of universal community and humanity, transcending the separation between the Hellenic and the barbarian. However, aside from its being institutionally constrained by the Roman Empire, this model of universality was inherently formal and depended upon the notion of membership. And so, therefore, Julian follows Badiou and others in reiterating the Pauline model. Christianity, he argues, overcomes the previous limitations of the common by establishing a direct link between the inmost singularity of the person and the universality of a community beyond membership. On this model, the common exists only as this logical immediacy between the singular and the universal. At the same time, the common has no particular existence, because if one construes the common as a positive given, as something concretely shared, it will collapse into particularity, the argument goes. The community of the resurrected Christ is a community of love which is beyond predication, uprooted from the contingent particularities of the world. The common transcends, is uprooted from actuality. Julian, following political ontology, thereby preempts any real discourse of what is shared. So, in this context, if one is to keep the concept of the common, it must be released from the horizon of positive being. That is the logical outcome of political ontology. At the same time, the historical reconstruction of the Christian event is, for that reason, I would suggest, tainted by the formalism of the Pauline model, according to which the Damascene experience of the apostle is a revelation of a quite schematic identification of the absolute categories of the universal and the singular. Julian reinterprets the rest of Christian history as a configuration and reconfiguration of the coincidence of the universal and the singular, but still in quite static terms. After the Christian event, interpreted on the Pauline model, the concept of the common, however, effectively disappears in Julian's account until it reappears as a problem for today. Missing is the description of the history of how the common has been interpreted and reinterpreted. And it is perhaps no wonder why, for political ontologists, Paul can figure as a rabbi, a prophet, or even a militant revolutionary, championing the gospel of a love beyond predication, membership, or particularity, yet seldom as a theologian, standing at the beginning of a long history of theological reflection on the common. But is it not possible to think of the long tradition of Trinitarian theology as precisely this, a sustained reflection on the common? The circuitous route from Trinity to ontology to politics and political ontology is speculative, to be sure, but it is not rare, as we are witnessing here in this conference. The Church's reflection on the Trinity have gone hand in hand with how it has spoken about being and politics. Now, obviously, I do not have time to unpack this claim in any sort of detail, yet I will attempt to indicate where one might find a link between the theological reflection of the Trinity and the meaning and reality of the common. And here I will just touch on a debate which might now be slightly passé, but I think it's still relevant to sort of draw out what I'm thinking of here. So Karen Kilby, among others, has raised significant objections against the approach of social Trinitarianism. And painting with a very, very broad brush, social Trinitarianism presents the Trinity as, quote, our social program, as an ideal society, a certain representation of the common, which is then supposed to be enacted in social, political, and ecclesial life. Kilby is highly critical of the project, and some of her objections are reminiscent of the concerns of political ontology. Social Trinitarianism projects anthropological characteristics onto the divine being before subsequently reflecting them back as normative for political life, she argues. It is one thing to differentiate human life in light of revelation, for example, by opting for the poor instead of the rich. It is something quite different to present grammatical and terminological solutions to the doctrine of the Trinity, like perichoresis, as an approachable ideal for human community, the claim goes. Such a move certainly exposes itself to the Feuerbachian critique of religious language. And further, one could claim that it duplicates and reflects modern society's difficulty with representing itself. As it seeks a representation of an ideal society in the messy reality of political life, social Trinitarianism betrays its aim, the identification of the ideal and the real, in what is ultimately, and this is a controversial claim, an immanent community. It is seeking the sublime object of the modern structure of representation. Kilby's alternative, coined apophatic Trinitarianism, curbs the ambition of Trinitarian speculation. God is closer to us than we are to ourselves, she observes. The very presence of God, one which offers no specifiable ground on which to stand, prevents us from turning Trinitarian language into an ideal and a social project. The Trinity is not a community, a vision of the common that we may enact in any simple fashion. Accordingly, she introduces a split into the practice of Trinitarian contemplation between a contemplation of and a contemplation in the Trinity. Kilby affirms the latter, a sharing in the common life of the Trinity, yet denies us the former. Although we partake in the Trinitarian life, she argues, we cannot represent it, turn it into a comprehensible object, and that is precisely what social Trinitarianism risks doing. By contrast, apophatic Trinitarianism offers rhyme, a kind of inner coherence, but no reason, no program that may be easily enacted. The political lessons, then, of apophatic Trinitarianism are derivative of the limits of human knowing and doing that Kilby thereby introduces. Trinitarian reflection, the argument goes, may teach us something about the limits of any human endeavor, but it does not provide us with an ideal representation of society, a clear model of what a truly shared life would look like. Apophatic Trinitarianism takes speculative theology to school. By critiquing all idealistic distractions from the suffering and realities of the world, it suggests a fidelity to the real. Note, however, that Kilby is nonetheless operating with two registers, that of the common life of the Trinity and of finite communities. That in itself is a crucial insight, for Christian theology has always operated with these two registers. Yet, by restricting Trinitarian language to rhyme without reason, I would argue that she has bracketed an important theological contribution to the reflection on the common. Kilby is surely right in refusing to present Trinitarian reflection as simply a representation of an ideal community to which we should aspire. Trinitarian theology has and should challenge the immanence of the structural representation in modern liberal democracies, a representation which is ultimately self-reflection, society's attempt to see itself. But I would venture that Trinitarian theology operates around the very intersections of finite and divine reality, where it is not as easy to circumscribe the limits of finite comprehension as Kilby assumes, and where it is difficult to distinguish between sharing and comprehension. The theological rules and principles learned are never of the purely formal grammatical sort, for no such rule exists. Further, these rules inevitably and immediately mingle and intertwine with other perspectives, interpretations, and rules through which we think and act in our daily lives. And thus, we must admit that it is not so easy to circumscribe the boundaries of finite communities either, not to speak of finite human communities. Trinitarian theology may follow political ontology. In going to that place where the categories of human sharing break down, where our attempts to give complete accounts of our shared condition come to a halt. It concerns itself with the moment when the divisions created by human borders and identities themselves are divided, as Giorgio Agamben would have it. However, for theology, this moment cannot just be a groundless void designated as the political. This sort of groundlessness is, in fact, no definitive proof of absence, no justification for the hegemony of potentiality and contingency. Instead, I would claim, Christian theology could interpret this failure as the entry point of another register of actuality, as the meeting point of the common life of human beings and the common life of God. It is here, sometimes, in this strange encounter, that the finite patterns of acting and speaking in common are shaped by what we must say about the divine life and what must, in light of that, be done differently. But this also means that we should not only speak of what we may become about our finite capacity to be different, but also, however difficult it may seem in today's context, what we already share and what among the things we share might be redeemed. This is the path which Trinitarian ontology takes and which differs from that of political ontology. It invites us to speak about what living beings share, about how we partake in the divine, and not least what God shares with God's self. It refuses to give up the reflection on the actuality of what we have in common. And it is here, starting from the insight that sharing, that community is in some sense double, and thus already more than itself, that Trinitarian theology finds its rhyme and, I would say, reason. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Ragnar. Okay, I'd now like to introduce Michael Northcott. He's Emeritus Professor of Ethics in the University of Edinburgh. He was Guest Professor in Systematic Theology at the University of Heidelberg in 2018, and is currently Professor of Religion and Ecology in the Indonesian Consortium of Religious Studies, University Gadjah Mada, Indonesia. He is well known for speaking and writing ecological theology, and his books include Place, Ecology and the Sacred, A Political Theology of Climate Change, A Moral Climate, The Ethics of Global Warming, and The Environment and Christian Ethics. Please, Michael Northcott.
Thanks very much, and to the organisers for the generous invitation to come to such a well-framed conference, which for my purposes is in a very useful building. Immediately below us here is the Zoology Museum of the University of Cambridge, where you can see a very different take on the history of life and anything that we'll hear in the conference today or tomorrow. And the building, of course, is named after David Attenborough, whose recent television programs have done so much to alert the population of the world, really, to the ecological crisis that we are currently living through. I've called the talk quite simply Trinity and Political Ecology, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Arles Trinity sarcophagus in a few minutes, but it's particularly distinctive for the fact that it displays the Creator as three persons and not one already in the 4th century. Given the state of Britain and British politics at the moment, some people are asking what is taught in Eton College and Oxbridge. I think that we know that the current Prime Minister likes and was taught the Greek classics, so representation of him as Icarus jumping off the cliffs of Dover is, I think, quite knowing. I think it's doubtful that he was taught the doctrine of the Trinity, but I'm going to suggest that the doctrine of the Trinity is at issue, and particularly Trinitarian ontology in some of the events that we're currently seeing in the rise of populist politics and the drift to the far right in the United States, in Britain, in Hungary, and in Brazil. Brazil, of course, is going through its own crisis after the election of Bolsonaro, which many people would say is a global and not only a local crisis, given that the burning of the Amazon, such a large scale in the last few months, does have an impact on the planet as a whole, not least in the repository that the Amazon represents of a huge range of endemic species which will be wiped out by the degree of burning that's going on at the moment. My friend Bruno Latour suggests that it's not coincidental that right-wing populists are acting concertedly at the present time to tear up environmental, social, and financial regulations. They know, he says, that the earth is calling time on illiberal individualist wealth accumulation, and they want to take what they see as their rightful inheritance before whatever end may come. You may think this is fanciful, but look at Trump's attack just announced this week on public clean water supplies in the United States, as well as on climate regulations. Bolsonaro's attack on the Amazon, and Brexiters announced plans to walk away from European Union social, environmental, and tax haven regulations. And there are also, of course, close ties between Brexit backers in this country, hedge funds and mining and fossil fuel investors. I'm going to suggest that there is a parallel ontologically between what's happening in these events, these political events, and what's happening in what many scientists and others in the humanities are increasingly calling the epoch or era of the Anthropocene in which we're now living. And the parallel I draw is between late neoliberalism and the Anthropocene concerns the closing down of multiple or plural loci of agencies. In political economy, it's well known that neoliberals focus their Bolshevik attacks on existing institutions by destroying alternate centers of agency other than those of economic and financial actors. These have included the UK, city and regional governments, most of which in the last 10 years have lost more than 60% of their budgets, trade unions, publicly owned services and agencies, universities, of course, religious communities, charities, cooperatives and mutuals such as the building societies torn apart by deregulation, professional guilds, and, to connect to the last paper, common lands and commons governance arrangements. The multiple centers of agency that developed in medieval Christendom centuries before the modern liberal nation state are being eroded, leaving what neoliberals like to call a level playing field for economic agents backed up by the Lockean promise of government to defend private property. And there is an analogy, it seems to me, between this attack on plural democratic agency and what's happening to beings in the Anthropocene. The being on the right is a 400 million year old fossil from West Yorkshire, known as Lestridodus newtoni, but more simply it's a shark with a rather interesting curved set of teeth preserved in this curved shape in the fossil that you can see in the basement of the museum downstairs. And such creatures over roughly 450 million years worked together, some would say, quasi-intelligibly, to evolve the terrestrial conditions that made mammals and ultimately Homo sapiens possible. But now human agencies are so powerfully exercised across the surface of the planet that they are displacing the agencies and influences of the collectivities of creatures, other creatures, with domestic animals, with fish and plants, which now far outweigh all other life. And of course, at the same time, Homo sapiens is intervening in the Independence Agency, as James Lovelock, of course, argued, not only of species, but of rocks and water and gases, and in so doing, rendering them incapable of saving us from our destruction of a stable climate. The point being that we cannot save ourselves from the consequences of our own actions without the aid of the other beings. E.O. Wilson, of course, makes the point that we should aim to set aside half of the surface of the earth for the others in order that resilient ecosystems can recover their capacities to absorb the waste of our activities and be filled with living beings whose activities in turn can then restore a resilient earth. That is still entirely possible, it seems to me. It's not by any means a foregone conclusion. We could not do this, but it would take concerted global action. It was, of course, David Attenborough who brought to the world's attention the degree to which not only atmospheric chemistry, but even the rocks and soils and oceans of the planet are being changed by human industrial creations, and particularly plastics, which are turning up not only in ocean water, but increasingly in ocean sediments. And this is a plasticized fossil, where the plastic has already become part of the rock that is being dug up in the ocean. And a very recent paper published this month from California found that already since 1945 to 2009, it is possible to trace a layer of sediment under the ocean which contains plastic detritus from human activity. And this is very much a marker of the Anthropocene. We are changing, humans have become a geological force. And future humans, when they were to drill down into the earth, will find novel substances in the industrial era that were not there before. In Brazil, the doctrine of the Trinity is particularly at issue in what's happening in the forests, because there is a dispute between Catholics and Pentecostals over the burning of the forests. The Catholic Church has come out against the burning of the forests. Many Pentecostals voted for Bolsonaro and are on the side of the landowners. And this is very curious if you look at the doctrine of the Trinity from the point of view of Immanuel Kant, who of course famously argued in these two quotes that the Trinity is such a mystery that it can really be of no use to us. And in particular, he said in the second quote, the doctrine of the Trinity taken literally has no practical relevance at all, even if we think we understand it. And it's even more clearly irrelevant if we realize that it transcends all our concepts. And it goes on, of course, to diss as well the doctrine of the Incarnation. But of course, Immanuel Kant's dissing of the Trinity was extremely influential and encouraged the liberal Protestant erasure, at least in the 19th century, of the doctrine of the Trinity. And in some parts of liberal theology, of the doctrine of the Incarnation as well. But it seems to me that in fact Kant is wrong, and that the Trinity, whether it's believed in or not, shapes how we think about one another, about politics, and about other creatures. And it seems to me also, it must be said, that the erasure of the doctrine of the Trinity did not begin with Immanuel Kant and has a much longer history. And I'm going to argue in a few slides that the retreat of Trinitarian ontology in the West has had impacts upon Western understanding of creatures and creaturely ontology, and that this retreat is particularly evident in the material culture of Latin Christianity, both in the liturgy and in art and in architecture, and that retreat is in some ways responsible for a more domineering attitude towards non-human creatures in the West than one finds in Eastern Christianity. But before the retreat, it will be good to look at the progress of the doctrine and its impacts. The conception of creation and creaturely being as involving God as Father, Son, and Spirit originates, of course, with Irenaeus of Lyon, who said the Word establishes that it works bodily and confers existence while the Spirit arranges and forms the various powers. So rightly is the Son called Word, and the Spirit the wisdom of God. And this conception is very much shown in the Ars Sarcophagus, which shows by the 4th century the idea of a Trinitarian creator had become mainstream in the Christian West. So it seems to me that right away, when we look at Christian material culture, Kant's challenge the doctrine of the Trinity as of no practical use is actually not true. And we do see the doctrine of the Trinity shaping both Christian political conceptions, but also Christian cultural conceptions of other creatures and their relationships to them. And I'm just going to briefly look at 3 examples, or sets of examples, first in art and then in dietary practices, and then in the liturgy. Among the most striking examples of the impact of the doctrine of a Trinitarian creator on the ontological status of plants and animals, I think, is the apse at the Church of San Clemente in Rome, which is really like a mandala. Now, this version of it is said to be 9th or 10th century, but many think that it's a copy of a much older fresco, and it is really an extraordinary image of the Trinitarian restoration of creation and the way in which many Trinitarian theologians believe that that restoration impacts upon all being and all life, and not only on humans. I think in a way even more remarkable image is this is an Ionian baptistry in Ravenna, which I happened to visit in April this year while at a conference in Bologna. And because the baptistry shows, and it's the mosaic is 5th century, the baptistry shows, of course, the Holy Spirit descending on Christ in the baptism, but it shows on the right the River Jordan personified. Now, there are many environmental philosophers who suggest that our problem as moderns is that we have too narrow a category of being as a result of the European Enlightenment, and by only considering persons as morally considerable, we have become almost incapable of giving moral credence and legal protection to other beings. And I think this extraordinary image shows that this is a problem more with modernity than it is with Christianity. Now, when it comes to Christians and animals, I think that there are a range of evidences that the incarnation, cross, crucifixion and resurrection of Christ changed Christian attitudes to animals, one of which, of course, is the famous injunction in Acts 15:20, which is largely ignored by Christians, except Seventh-day Adventists, who are to this day vegetarians. But early Christian art has no images of meat being eaten or served in Christian gatherings. St. Paul was very down on the practice of eating meat in public among Christians. And these kinds of displays of festivals, which are not only Eucharistic displays, but displays of feasting among Christians, are very striking in their contrast with Roman art, where meat would have formed the central object of the feast. But I think even stronger evidence that the Trinitarian doctrine of the creation produced new relations to other animals comes from the lives of the Desert Fathers. And these include numerous stories where the saints are said to have formed companion relationships with wild animals, to have aided them in some ways, such as, of course, in the famous picture of St. Jerome plucking a thorn from the paw of a lion, or being aided or even fed by them. Finally, there is the liturgy. My former colleague J.P. Mackey, I think, argued in the book Christian Experience of God as Trinity, I think quite convincingly, the emergent doctrine of a Trinity arose not only from scriptural evidences referred to by Archbishop Rowan this morning, but also from religious experience, the experience of God as still present after the ascension of Christ, as well as the experience of God in Christ in his earthly life. And two of the ways in which we see this in the New Testament is first the Pauline claim that right worship enables the gift of the indwelling Spirit to be realized in the believer, both body and soul. And this, of course, was critical in the distinction between catechumens and the baptized. And second, there is the emergent belief that the Holy Spirit was distinctively present in sacramental worship, and in particular in the leavened bread, which symbolized the leavening of the Spirit in the community of believers, and of course, the Spirit giving life again to the body of Christ resurrected from the dead. Now, I'm going to argue in the next few slides that against what some have suggested thus far in this conference, there is quite a significant difference between East and West when it comes to Trinitarian relational ontology. Now, many people think that the break between East and West is most focused upon the doctrine of the Trinity, and especially the filioque clause. But the origins of the break actually arose from the Roman adoption of the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist in the 8th century. The Orthodox began to hear about this practice. They went and visited Rome. They sent representatives. They challenged the Romans, and they said, this is not right. This is what they call dead bread. And they thought it represented a return back to the Old Covenant, since it was the bread of the Passover. But equally, the dispute represented a theological disagreement over the pneumatological status of creatures in the Eucharist. For the Orthodox, the leavening Spirit at work in and since the resurrection in recapitulating creation towards a restored paradise is symbolized in the leavening of the bread. And to say symbolized means to say leavened bread, leavened by the Spirit, participates in salvation. And so the central question, it seems to me, is whether the divergence between Byzantium and Rome is merely cultural material in this way, or whether it has also doctrinal roots. To answer this question, I think we need to revisit Augustine's account of the Trinity and creation and ask how he conceived the relation of God and creatures, and to what extent he argued for an enduring relational participation between creatures and their Creator. The difficulty with claiming continuity between West and East in doctrine is that Augustine's account in De Trinitate and elsewhere weights the creator-creature relation almost entirely in the original creative acts. The goodness of creatures is caused by the original acts of willing and ordering imposed from creation at its origins. As he puts it in the literal meaning of Genesis, when creatures remain in the state in which they have been created, possessing the perfection they have received, they are good individually and all in general are very good. Observe the beauty of the world and praise the plan of the Creator. Observe what he made, love the one who made it, because he also made you his lover in his own image. But there's something very static in Augustine's account of creation beyond the original acts of creation. It isn't possible to move without great difficulty, it seems to me, from Augustine Trinitarianism to modern biological accounts, or even geological accounts of the kind below us here, of creaturely agency, which helps to explain, I think, why Whitehead, though a theist, was not a Trinitarian. For Augustine, only humans are in a process of becoming and of movement back to God. Hence, ongoing creaturely participation in God is only ever admitted by Augustine, as far as I can find it, in the following statement. When people see these things, your works of creation, with the help of your Spirit, it is you, God, who are seeing in them. When, therefore, they see that things are good, you are seeing that they are good. Whatever pleases them for your sake is pleasing you in them. The things which, by the help of your Spirit, delight us are delighting you in us. To put this in other words, only humans, through reason and intelligence, relationally and continuously, participate in the divine Trinity after the original acts of creation. And I think it is for this reason that in Western Christendom, we see through the Middle Ages a growing attitude of human dominion, including creativity, the use of creativity towards other creatures, which increasingly expresses degrees of instrumental use and power over other creatures and creative forces, as of course Lynn White Jr. famously argued in an article in the journal Science in 1967, where he clearly makes a distinction, I might say, between Latin Christianity and Byzantium, and this is normally forgotten. People always say Lynn White Jr. just says Christianity is a source of the environmental crisis. He doesn't say that. He specifically identifies Latin Christianity. Now, what's the evidence that relational ontology in relation to creatures is different in the East and the West? Well, I'm going to present very briefly, only two witnesses. The first is Basil and his Hexameron, which is a remarkable work, I think, for the depth of knowledge of the non-human it displays, including, for example, marine biology. He spent a lot of time talking to fishermen before he wrote it. In one place he says, yesterday it was said, let the waters produce moving things, and today let the earth bring forth a living creature. Is the earth then alive? And are the mad-minded Manichaeans right in giving it a soul? At these words, let the earth bring forth, it did not produce a germ contained in it, but he who gave the order at the same time gifted it with the grace and power to bring forth. And that's a very different claim to the claim that you find in Augustine. He gifted it with its own grace and power to continue to produce and bring forth new life, new creatures. And then he goes on, in the same homily, 8.1, God, after the command given to the waters to bring forth moving creatures that have life, created simply living bodies for aquatic animals, whilst for terrestrial animals he commanded the soul to exist and to direct the body. Without doubt, terrestrial animals are devoid of reason, but at the same time, how many affections of the soul each one of them expresses by the voice of nature. And here you have the early idea of the microcosm-macrocosm relationship between the human and human being, and all the other creatures of creation, which of course is taken up by Maximus the Confessor. And there's no time, and I know I'm going to speak of Maximus later. I have only one direct quote from him, from Ambiguum 7, where he says, for the Logos of God and God will always and in all things accomplish the mystery of his embodiment. For Maximus, creatures realize different logoi, which are patterns of being, that converge on the divine Logos, which for Maximus is eternally as well as historically incarnate. As a recent commentator summarizes, all beings have a purpose beyond themselves for Maximus in the harmonious coexistence with all other beings in love, at the transformation of created being into the final blessed and glorious condition. Creatures are accorded value as creatures of God, since they all mirror the divine perfections of the Logos. Now, it seems to me that it's not a coincidence, therefore, that modern science and the scientific method developed in the West, in the Latin West, and then the Reformed West, where it continued, and not in the Byzantine East. This is because the West abandoned, I would argue, the Trinitarian analogy of being as going all the way down, and the symbolic culture which this analogy produced in the East, in favor of a newly vacated created order, which after Paracelsus, Copernicus, and Newton becomes newly available for human reordering, as of course Caroline Merchant argues in her book, The Death of Nature. It isn't then just the stability of divine law that explains the rise of modern science in the West, but the absence in the West, particularly after the late medieval break with Aristotle's medical theories, of a cosmology which unites the seen and the unseen worlds, ideas and forms, as it endured in the East. The unfolding of Western science produced a view of matter on the earth as dead, and of other creatures ultimately as feeling no pain, and hence available for instrumental human use. Now, I would also call a more recent witness to this claim concerning the status of bread between East and West. There's a wonderful anthropology written by a woman called Juliette de Boulay called Cosmos, Life and Literature in a Greek Orthodox Village. I think it has an introduction by Andrew Luth, I think maybe here. But in it she gives really extraordinary evidence that Orthodox Trinitarian ontology is radically different from the Latin and Reformed West in the way that it shapes how Greek people break bread, almost into the modern day. And this was a village that was cut off, but it didn't have a main road going into it. And she describes the baking of bread in that village as a continuously holy event, which continuously represents on a daily basis, as well as a weekly basis, the Eucharistic reality that Christ is known in the breaking of the bread, and the Spirit is known in the leavening of the bread. And so each loaf in that village is marked with a cross, and the whole process of growing the wheat, of gathering the wheat, of milling the bread, of baking the bread, breaking the bread, all of it is a sacred event. Now, by contrast, in the same decade of the 1950s, here in Britain, we were inventing the wonderful Chorley wood process, which is a bread-making process which is so debased bread that millions of people now wrongly believe they're allergic to gluten. Indeed, I did for many years. Whereas they're in fact merely allergic to the Chorley wood process. Because what the Chorley wood process does is to make bread so rapidly that gluten does not have a sufficient time to ferment as it needs to do in order for it to be digested. And then to add insult to injury, as far as the human stomach is concerned, they add even more raw gluten immediately before the bread enters the oven after a very brief proving period. There's a reason why Polish people, when they come to live in Britain, bring their own bread with them. They know our bread is poisonous. But my deeper point is that this is an anthropological marker to this day of the difference that I'm arguing for between the significance of creaturely spiritual symbolism in the East and in the West. Now, of course, it's not exclusive to Orthodox Christians. We can find analogies for this same way of acting and behaving towards other beings in many other cultures. I'm living and working some of the time now in Indonesia, and a very fine anthropological study in Papua New Guinea by the anthropologist Roy Rappaport traced precisely the role of religious ritual among the Sembaga people on the island of Papua New Guinea in enabling them to live with their domesticated animals within the carrying capacity of their ecosystems. And of course, Pope Francis recognizes something very similar in Laudato Si, when a number of times he praises indigenous peoples as peoples who have learned, unlike we moderns, and unlike he does admit at one point, Latin Christians, who have learned to live within the limits of creation and justly towards not only each other, but towards other being and other life. But I fear it will take more than one encyclical to restore the Trinitarian relation ontology of non-humans in the Christian as well as the Catholic West in our time. And for me, the last great book that Roy Rappaport wrote was called Ritual, Religion and the Making of Humanity. He wrote it just before he died. And in this book, he makes this superb claim, and he's not a theist or a theologian or anything. But he says the ecosystem concept is neither pure discovery nor pure fabrication. it may well be fair to say that it bears as much resemblance to religious conceptions as it does to the descriptive statements of modern science. It may, as it were, mediate between them and as such serve well as the ground for a revitalized logos, a feature of which is integration, wholeness, or holiness. I leave it there, but it's really a quite remarkable claim. Now, I'm going to end with this, just a brief reference to James Lovelock. Now, of course, Basil said the Earth is not alive, and James Lovelock says it is alive. I attended a wonderful conference at Exeter a month ago where his centennial was celebrated. Many papers were given on the Gaia theory, which is now really mainstream science. What the Gaia theory reveals is that over 4 billion years, what Maximus calls the logoi have gradually prepared the way on Earth for the evolution of human beings, not only among other living creatures, but even among rocks and gases and in the water. Our current ecological dilemma is that we should not be in charge of Gaia. Her multiple agencies know better than us how to birth and sustain life in all its beauty and diversity. So we urgently need to recover something like a Gaian relational Trinitarian ontology if we are to allow the Earth and her creatures and her patterns, her logoi, to restore the Earth to its wholeness, which we urgently need to do. And I end with a quote from a Catholic artist in Indonesia who is clearly thinking in these terms when he says, because humanity and the universe all come from the Holy Spirit, we have to respect nature, as there is a sliver of the Holy Spirit in each element in nature. That's why we can't randomly cut down trees or kill animals or throw garbage into the river. Life with a spiritual wholeness is a life at one with nature. Thank you very much.
We now we'll have to be quite quick, but we now have a short time for questions. Okay, so we've got the mic. Ryan, got a question over here. Ryan, just behind you.
I really appreciated both of the talks. Professor Northcott, I guess my main concern, I really appreciated your talk, but I think my main concern would be that when responding to the ecological crisis from a Trinitarian perspective, it seems that really important that we keep a differentiation of consciousness in mind. And what I mean by that is you can't just revert back to ancient cosmologies because there is a difference between symbolic thinking, scientific thinking, all of these different ways we think about the Earth, right? So one of the problems, it seems to me, with the far right is that they ignore modern scientific evidence as much as it is that they've lost a sort of larger symbolic cosmology that, would induce responsibility. So I guess I would want to say I really appreciated your talk, but I don't know if it's helpful to trace it back to this, what seems to me in the Catholic tradition, an advancement of thought about how we can use leaven and unleaven as a symbol, but it is only a symbol. It's not actually a crucial difference in our doctrine of the Eucharist. So it seems to me that was an advancement that perhaps maybe did lead to sort of bias that became something other than Christian, sure, but it was an advancement, and same thing with modern science, was an advancement, though it came with biases. Does that make sense?
I'm sure the audience will be pleased to know that the Pope and the Patriarch agreed no longer to disagree about the unleavened bread in 1895. So, I don't think we need to worry about this as a cause of ecumenical dispute anymore, though they've taken a lot longer to get around to sorting out the Filioque clause. I use this not as a sort of definitive evidence of the break, but as to make the underlying point about we talk about mere symbols, or mere myths, mere narratives. Science alone as a culture is proving incapable of persuading us to change our ways. These ecological events we're living through need cultural mediation.
Absolutely.
And my point is that the cultural mediation offered to us by the richer symbolic relational ontology, which I find in indigenous cultures, in Hinduism, for example, not only in the Orthodox East, can help us also in understanding why Western intelligibility, Western reason, Western scientific method alone are not sufficient to change our culture in the direction it needs to go if we're going to do something about the state of the planet.
Do you have anyone else over here? Got a microphone.
Professor Northcott, dare I ask, are you a vegetarian?
What did he say? What did he say?
Asked you if you're a vegetarian, Michael.
I'm not a vegetarian. I live in part of the year in Asia, and I was a vegetarian before I moved to Malaysia in 1984. And then we found it was very difficult, because particularly Chinese cuisine, it's extremely hard to avoid meat. So I've not lost the capacity to eat meat since, though my daughter has actually, because it can be difficult in Asia if you can't eat meat, to eat at all. But I try to avoid it when I can. I put it no more strongly than that. But I do admit, maximum culpa, that I rather enjoyed the possibly Irish-originated beef that was served up in Peterhouse last night. So there you are.
I think, Jonathan, you wanted to say something? Or no, you've got a question.
Yes, so I have a question for Ragnar now. It's a very simple question. I'd like you to give me some more detail on exactly what the concept of the common is. I think there are 4 different technical terms here that we need to define, and you gave definitions for most of them. So you told us that the universal, you're taking that as the exceptionless. You defined it extensionally, and I take it exceptionless translates as absolute in scope. Then you gave us the particular, and you glossed that as the enclosed, that which is limited or marked out.
Yeah.
Then thirdly, we have the singular. You didn't give us a definition for that, I think, but maybe something like definitive or unique presence might not be a bad gloss. And then amongst that, we're supposed to situate the concept of the common. And you as a reminder, you said that it's a political notion, that it's a transcendental precondition for the polis. You did say it's indefinite in limit, but then later on you say that our need is to uproot it from ontology and to draw it out from the domain of positive being. So that makes it sound rather like the particular. Can you unpack my confusion?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, these terms come from sort of the typology that Julien actually constructs. And very simply, the common just means what is shared. It is the very, very, very simple notion of what we have in common. And Julien would, I mean, especially with the terms universal, particular, and singular, they are thrown around and changed by different authors. Some people use particular, what other people would call singular, and so forth. For Julien, the singular is the opposite of the universal in the sense that it's something that cannot be repeated in any way or form. Right? Whereas for he constructs an opposition between the common and the particular, and though it's perhaps not a strict opposition, it is basically the particular is a sharing that is restricted to a certain context. Now, I was not saying, maybe I wasn't clear, I was not saying myself that I think we should uproot the common from positive being. I'm saying political ontology seeks to do that because it found society interpreted in an ontological frame as too difficult to negotiate. So, and I'm highly critical of that attempt because on the one hand, you have big claims about strict identification between universal projects and like our inmost singular nature are somehow coinciding, right? But you skip all the negotiation, all the discourse about what do we actually share in common, how can that exclude and not exclude, and so forth. I hope that's clarifying.
Do you have anyone else? Over here, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for your papers. The rehabilitation of the common, the protection of the environment depends on the building consensus of the entire body politic. Why use a specifically Christian doctrine to advance this? Or rather, how might a Trinitarian imagination help build this consensus among people who do not necessarily subscribe to a Trinitarian doctrine?
Is that for me or for?
If you could take it, I think.
I'll start. Well, first of all, I think we have to recognize that if we are posing this in terms of global political problems, Trinitarian ontology won't do the whole work by itself, right? In a sense, like we have to recognize also the impotence of Christian language in the current political world. So, I mean, one example, in speaking about the ecological crisis, right? Our very fact of going here to this conference is part of what is creating the same kind of crisis we are trying to deal with, right? And so the very context in which we try to reshape our language and reshape our understanding of the world is also a context that is actually working against that very process, right? So that's sort of my first point. It's a kind of bit of a warning saying that there's a certain impotence here in what we do. Secondly, I think still we have, I mean, Northcott pointed out large anthropological and cultural traces inheritance from the Christian tradition that are still with us. But I think that Trinitarian reflection has still to happen in ecclesial contexts, and they are also restricted, right? And it has to do a bit with the impotence, but also we have to have a life of prayer and worship, and that's why I don't want to say that only Trinitarian ontology can save us as a matter of fact, right? As this is a solution, right? But this is at least this is the context in which I think and sort of seek to rethink political life. And with that, I would say Trinitarian ontology sort of suggests that we shouldn't refuse on thinking in the intersection between actuality and the common, and then also transcendence. Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
Anything quickly?
No, it's fine. It's good.
Okay, well, I think we'll end on that note. So thank you very much to Michael and to Ragnar. And let's have lunch.